Okay, you guys, I had said in the previous video that I recorded and put up just before this one's going to go up, or the day before at least, that I probably wasn't, or that I didn't have plans to do a top whatever worst movies for the year. And then Movieman got on there and made a comment during the premiere of the video, and I was like, now I feel like I really should do it. So I decided I would go ahead and do it. Anyway, you guys, it's no big deal. You guys know how much I love to talk about movies, but I was just like, I didn't know if I didn't know if I had it in me, basically schedule-wise, to do this. But I did manage to crunch and cobble together a slideshow, another slideshow. I've got some video files downloaded for it. And I definitely have a smaller list for this than I do for the movies that I like. And actually, there were many more movies that I did like this year. They just didn't end up on the list because I didn't feel strongly enough about them to really talk about them to any great degree. And this one, there are no honorable mentions for top worst. And I barely found 10. And sort of like, I was trying to think of what's my criteria for what in my mind makes a particular movie one of the worst that I've seen this year. So several of the movies on here are probably, well, they have been well received by official critics and maybe by most people, most of the audience, though maybe not necessarily. I mean, there's certainly a lot of negative ratings for several of these that I've picked, but I decided that the way I would sort of judge what I consider to be one of the worst movies would be different criteria. And it could be one or multiple of these criteria. It would be like writing.
Oh, so you are doing the answer.
Oh, you're interrupting me.
Carry on with your bad movie discussion.
All right, I'll try to remember what the heck I was saying. I think I was saying that the different criteria that I use would be things like maybe bad writing. Well, I was going to say bad story, but the writing kind of goes in with that. Though you can still have decent writing, but the story itself be not so great, if that makes sense. And also things like how, or like whether I feel that a movie is so caustic that it left a really bad taste in my mouth as far as just the message that it's putting out there. And it's really funny because there are certain ways a message can be gotten across to people without basically making it seem like you are villainizing a particular group of people or, you know, stuff like that. So there are at least 2 movies on this list that, while they might have been no, one of them has pretty bad writing. While they might have been very well acted, technically it's pretty much okay, but the underlying theme of these movies was so negative and so, in my opinion, divisive and unnecessarily so, that I just cannot think of these movies in a very positive light. And so therefore that's also why they ended up on my worst list. So, you know, I don't know. A lot of you guys may disagree completely with the ones I've picked. Now, the one that I have at number 10, I'll go ahead and start. I'll start the slides. This almost said slide stream. Woo! It's not even that late, but I tell you, my brain is frazzled. Okay. Number 10, because there are no honorable mentions, number 10 is Promising Young Woman. Now, the reason I put this at number 10, I feel like actually I really could move this much higher on the list because I was not fond of this. I did not appreciate this movie at all, really. I mean, there were some positive things that I could say about it in my review, but just in general, as a whole, I did not like this film. And I go into great detail about that in my review because I had seen a screening of it. But the reason I put this at 10 is because technically it's a 2020 movie, which I did not realize at the time I put this list together. But then I found out what happened was it came out December 25th of 2020, but it wasn't made available on digitally until 2021, which was when I saw it. I think I saw it sometime in January, and I was of the understanding that it had just come out. It was like I thought it was a January release, but technically it wasn't. However, because it was officially released on digital in 2021, I put it in my list. Yes, that's cheating a little bit. Sorry about that, but it's my list. If I had had more than 10 movies, I might have added this one as sort of an honorable mention only because of that. But anyway, Promising Young Woman. The acting is fine. The direction of the movie is fine as far as the technical stuff goes, cinematography, sound, editing, all of that is fine. But the story itself, to me, left a lot to be desired, and I felt like it was just so, I felt like it was so negative and nasty in general about men as a whole. And there's already enough of that going on in society, has been for decades. It's just getting worse and worse and worse, that I felt like a movie like this was not something that was presented in a very constructive way. In fact, the premise for the main drive for her anger was it was actually in a lot of gray area for me, the situation that happened with her friend, and I explained that in detail in the review that I made. And I just, as a whole, I really resented the tone of this film. I know it got a lot of love from critics. A lot of people loved it, of course, like especially the critics, because they really like this type of thing. I guess depends on who's being demonized as to, as to what they choose to like. Well, they really love this because it demonizes men. And I just had no love for this, really. Despite the positive aspects, certain positive aspects to it, I just felt like this was pretty terrible, and I was not supportive of it at all. And anyway, so that's my number 10. Now my number 9. I'm getting kind of in a foul mood already. This is maybe one of the reasons I didn't want to do this list, or I was thinking that wouldn't be a good idea to do it, because I'm just putting me in a funky mood to be bitching about movies that got under my skin. Okay, number 9. 6 Minutes to Midnight. This movie had a lot of potential, but it fundamentally, it was so disappointing because you don't really get a good feel for the characters. You can't really connect with them. And then the writing just completely, it tanks so bad. It's based on true events, but I don't think, I think that I believe I mentioned in my review that mainly really the true event was that there was a school for these German kids in the UK or something like that. I don't think that a lot of the drama and suspense and action that happened in this movie really ended up happening in the true events. But this film, it felt like it floundered. There wasn't a good connection with the characters, and the writing, just like I said at the very end, some of the stuff that was going on with the characters was just nonsensical, and I was disappointed in it. Now, that's part of the reason why some of these movies end up on my list. It's like, because I go into it expecting there's going to be something much better that it ends up being, and then it's just like, what the heck? And maybe if I hadn't known anything about it going into it, I would feel better about it. But this one was just one of the ones that's like, this is just fundamentally not a very good movie. And so that's why it ended up on the list. Okay, number 8. Yes, I might get a lot of hate for this. A lot of people love this movie, Godzilla vs. Kong. I enjoyed aspects of it. It was fun to watch on the big screen, to see these big monsters duke it out and everything. But there were so many problems with the writing, the plot, the characters, and some characters kind of thrown in. It just felt like they were just thrown in there just to sort of harken back to the previous movie in the series. And so what was the point of them? And it tried to take itself seriously. See, there are some other movies that I watched this year that were so ridiculous and over the top and crazy, like Hitman's Wife's Bodyguard. But the reason I enjoyed that one and it connected with me better than, like, let's say a movie like this is because Hitman's Wife's Bodyguard, that's just one example, it didn't take itself seriously. So therefore, I could go into it with a different mindset. This movie, or come away from it with a different mindset. This movie took itself seriously, but it had some of the dumbest stuff that was happening in there. I mentioned in my review. And so while it was fun, it was enjoyable to an extent. And it was great to see that this movie performed quite well at the box office, because this was one of the earlier sort of blockbustery type of films that people went to the theater to see, and it did pretty well. I can't remember if by the time this came out, they were still blocking off seats in the theater. I don't recall. I want to say I think they were, but yet it still did surprisingly well considering those limitations. But as a whole, I just was disappointed in this movie, and I felt like Skull Island was so much better. Even the I think, what was the one? I can't remember the one that came. The one that came right before, like King of Monsters or something like that. I felt like that was better than this one, and even though that one really wasn't my favorite. Anyway, just a disappointment. I go in hoping for something a little bit better than what I came away feeling. So that's why this movie ended up on my list. Okay, number 7. Kind of the same thing. I didn't go see this on the big screen. I watched an advanced screening of it, and I did a review of it as well. Hold on a minute.
Come on, Lena, let's go.
Okay, what was I saying? This is my second interruption. Maybe I'll get through this list. Yeah, this, I watched an advanced screening of it, and I'm glad I didn't go see it on the big screen, because this also was rather disappointing. There were some characters in here that were fun to watch, and some of the action scenes were kind of cool. But as a whole, I just wasn't super fond of this, and felt like that the acting wasn't super great in some parts, and the storyline itself just felt a bit rushed, and I just couldn't really connect again with the characters very well. And so because this one was more disappointing than not, that's why it ended up on my list. Okay, moving on to 6. Yeah, Venom 2. It was fun to an extent, but there were too many things wrong with this movie, which I go into detail about in my review. It was, okay, so I specifically talked about Nobody in my top 10 movies, and in the discussion that I had about that, I mentioned Venom and how both of them are roughly the same runtime length, but one is written so solidly and the other was just not. And if you want to, compare and contrast, like I said, good quality writing and subpar writing, you can watch those two movies, and just because in a lot of ways, parts of this movie felt very rushed. Characters weren't developed very well at all, as opposed to in the Nobody movie, where they were, even though it was still a rather short film. And it just wasn't put together well. I had speculated whether or not there had been things edited out of this, but then I remembered that I'd seen Andy Serkis mention that this movie was short for a reason or whatever. I didn't exactly watch why he said it was short for a reason, but I feel like in the case of this movie, the brief length of time that it lasts ended up being a lesser quality film. Maybe it would have been better if they'd stretched it out a little more, but I don't feel that Woody Harrelson was utilized very well, and the girl who played his lady love, she was just not a very well written character either, and just fundamentally a disappointment compared to the first one. A lot of people weren't crazy about the first one, but I enjoyed the first one, and this one compared to that was just did not measure up. Despite some of the enjoyable moments in the film, as a whole it just didn't measure up to the first one for me. So there's that. All right, we're halfway done with this list. Okay, number 5. The Guilty with Jake Gyllenhaal. I did a review on this as well. This movie, okay, This movie was what made me start to really dislike the sound of Jake Gyllenhaal's voice. I kid you not, you guys. He got on my nerves so much in this film. I wanted him to just be quiet and stop talking. And then I've been seeing for that movie Ambulance, which actually looks like a pretty cool movie, but he's in it and he's talking in there, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't stand your voice anymore. I think his voice has been ruined for me because of this movie. And I went and watched the original right after I had seen this. I mean, within like a day or two. And I did start making comparison notes because I've been planning to do a comparison video, like why this one didn't work whereas the original did. And it's not just because the original is the original and this one's a remake, because some remakes can actually do pretty decently. This one did not. It's like everything, they did everything wrong with this that was done right with the first one. Part of it was his attitude. He starts off being supremely unlikable. And then his overreactions. The way he acted in this movie would not have flown at all in a real 911 dispatch center. It just wouldn't. That doesn't count the glass beside the computer, because in the original, that happens too. That wouldn't fly either, but at the same time, we don't know what their standards are over there, because I think the original came from like Sweden or Denmark or something like that. Maybe they don't have that same sort of rule about non-spillable glasses, whatever. But here they do. And so that was a big boo-boo. And my brother, he's a 911 dispatcher, and he said this dude would have been fired like 19 times before the actual big call came in, the one that makes up the bulk of the story. But because he's so unlikable, I could not connect with his character at all. And because of that, when the end happened, I didn't give a crap about him. I didn't care this big reveal of what he had done. I was like, I don't care. I don't like you. So I don't really care what happens to you. So, I mean, his character just was, he just really annoyed the absolute hell out of me. And I was glad when this movie was over, let me tell you. He overdid it too with the acting. When I was watching this, I was thinking of that term that was applied to Jim Carrey in one of the blooper scenes for Liar Liar. He overacted. He was an overactor in here. And it just didn't, a lot of people were praising it. They thought it was great. And I'm sitting there thinking, no, it's terrible. It does not connect with me. It turns me off as opposed to making me making me feel sorry for you. He just turned this character into someone I couldn't stand. When I watched the original, so much different the way that guy played it. Just so much better, and just kind of also leads you along. Like, you don't really form any specific... No, you do, because the character in the original, he's more likable. You don't know a lot about him because he's just kind of quiet, a little more reserved. You know something is bothering him, but not to the extent that you do with Jake's character in this movie. He's just like flying off the handle, sucking on his inhaler, gagging and practically throwing up in the bathroom in the middle of whatever, throwing things around, yelling, hanging up on people. It's just like, oh my gosh, this movie. So yeah, because his character annoyed me so much, that's why this movie ended up so high on the list. Whew, I can tell I'm just getting annoyed talking about it. Okay. Whew, all right. Here we go. Number 4. Army of the Dead. This movie, oh my gosh. I did a collab review with my son after we got home from watching this film, and I was so pissed off at how terribly this movie was written, this story was written. It's so funny because this is a Zack Snyder movie and story, and this ends up on my worst list, whereas Justice League, another Zack Snyder product from 2021, was my number 1. It was so freaking good. And so I went into this movie expecting that it was going to be solid quality like Justice League was, and it was terrible. I mean, it started off okay, and there were certain scenes in there that were okay, but just like midway or more through the movie, the characters start doing the dumbest stuff, and the writing just goes crazy. And I go into this extensively in the review, but it was just, they were doing such stupid stuff. I was just getting angrier and angrier, and I kept muttering to Arturo in the theater while we were watching it. And I was like, I was annoyed that we had even taken the time to go see it in the theater because it would have been better just watch it at home and be mad at home. Whereas I'm sitting in the theater just grumbling like, that's so dumb. That makes no sense. Why are they doing that? This is so stupid. It was just so bad. And yeah, so these top ones are generating a lot of annoyance with me. I think number 10 got me kind of fired up talking about it too, but I can tell like from 5 and on, maybe I'm just going to be in a foul mood the rest of this video. Okay, number 3. Oh boy, this movie. All right. One of the reasons this film ends up so high on my list is because I went into this with, I want to say high anticipation, though by the time I went to go see it, I already was aware there might be some trouble with it, but I still went into it with an open mind, and it started off okay enough. There was a misstep in the beginning, like sort of with the firemen. That was like, oh, I don't know about that. That was the first time that things weren't going to go well for this movie. Now, strangely enough, I enjoyed watching it. I would watch it again, but compared to the excellency that was Halloween 2018, this was a huge disappointment. Even though I liked it, it wasn't as good as, but it was fundamentally a huge disappointment. And especially the more time that goes by and the more I think about where this movie went wrong, all the things that made this movie just not what I feel like it should have been. I feel like we've been misled by David Gordon Green, and now I'm quite nervous about Halloween Ends because I fear that he has taken this in a direction that the Halloween franchise has already gone in, and that didn't end very well for me either. So hold on a minute. This is my 3rd interruption now.
This disappointing top 10?
Yeah, my worst top 10s.
Oh, I thought you weren't going to do worst.
I wasn't, but D Movieman talk me into it.
He used trickery. He used the Sith way.
He used the Sith way.
Do it. Do it.
It just, he just, I was like, oh, maybe I can. Okay, what was the same? Yeah, just how it was fundamentally so disappointing, and I don't have a lot of optimism for this particular iteration of the Halloween timeline. I'm not full of the same level of confidence and faith that I was after I saw Halloween 2018. I felt really good about this when I saw that movie, and then just completely the opposite after seeing this film. So I don't know. Halloween Ends is going to go on my list, my upcoming list of most anticipated movies for 2022. But that's kind of like with mixed feelings. So, okay. Number 2. Candyman. For pretty much the same reason that I did not like Promising Young Woman, Candyman ends up quite high on the list because of its racially divisive narrative and tone, which was so completely different from the original Candyman. And I feel like it was, and not just that, but the writing. I mean, it tanked about 2/3 of the way through. The characters started doing things that made no sense, and directions were taken that made no sense, and scenarios were presented and played out that were so nonsensical and absolutely ridiculous and over the top that I was rolling my eyes while I was watching it. And so it was really frustrating to go in there kind of, I was excited. I thought, because I was like, oh, maybe this is going to be really good. And I thought that I knew that the critics had given it pretty good ratings. Of course they did. Just like they gave Promising Young Woman good ratings. Like I said, depending on what group is being demonized, it will determine whether the critics love it or not. So in the case of Promising Young Woman, it was men. And in the case of Candyman, it's white people. And that was just a huge turnoff for me. I felt like it wasn't a message that was presented in a way that it's something that could be, what's the word I'm looking for? It wasn't presented in a feasible way because some of the situations and scenarios were so ridiculous and over the top, and wasn't presented in a way that would make you think about things like, let's say, the first Candyman, or let's say even the Kingsman. It's a totally different subject matter, but the Kingsman, like I had mentioned in my review for it, it's fundamentally an anti-war film, not necessarily glorifying violence or things like that, but just making you think about just the senselessness of stuff like that. But yet it was done in a way that, to me, whereas I understand sometimes wars are fought and war's absolutely awful. If it weren't for the fact that some wars had been fought, life would be much worse in a lot of ways for different people. But I felt like the Kingsman walked that line in a really good way to sort of, this is the message, without being offensive about it, if that makes sense. Candyman did not do that, and it was a huge turnoff for me. And it really was aggravating to see how much this film was praised and the critical circles. And I was like, if the writing had been more solid, maybe I could get the praise. But because, like I said, on top of just this absolutely divisive and caustic narrative that went along with this movie, the writing sucked so bad as the movie went on, that it was just irredeemable for me. Despite there being some parts of the movie that I liked, like in all of these movies, there are some parts that I liked okay. But as a whole, there's just too much negative to override those pros for me. So hence, that's why they end up on this list. Okay, number 1. Now, I knew that this was going to be my number 1 as soon as I started thinking about this list. And I'll tell you the main reason why. Well, let me show you what number 1 is. The Green Knight. Oh, geez, you guys. Beautiful cinematography and excellent acting does not a good movie make. And that was the case, in my opinion, with The Green Knight. I don't care what the critics said. This is another one of those examples of the critics just loving a movie that's completely idiotic. And this movie was one of those movies. The cinematography, the acting, that was not good enough to redeem this film for me. And the reason it ended up in my number 1 is because while Army of the Dead pissed me off and I was annoyed that we'd gone to the theater to watch it because of how bad it was, I still don't regret that I watched it, that I took the time to watch it. I 100% regret that I took the time to watch this movie. That's why this ends up on number 1. This is the only one in the list that I vehemently am annoyed at myself that I actually took the time out of my life to watch this film. It was so pretentious, and it was so weird and ridiculous. And like I said, when the giant showed up, I was just mentally checked out by that point. I was like, nope, I'm out of here in my brain. So there was just no saving the movie at that point for me. And so that's why this ends up on my number 1. I have gone into, or I went into more detail as far as why I didn't like this movie, why it was so frustrating for me in my review. I believe, just like with my other top 10 favorites, I believe I've done a review about all of these movies. They're on my channel, pretty sure. So yeah, if you want more detailed explanation as to why I couldn't stand these films, or why I classify them as some of my personal worst films of the year, you can go check out those reviews if you're interested. If you're not tired of hearing me rant about them in this review, in this top 10 listing. Anyway, that's my list for top 10 worst films of 2021. I'm sure probably you guys will disagree with some of the ones on this list. That's perfectly fine. But I'm curious to know, what are your personal top 10 worst films, or top 5, or whatever. I wasn't sure that I'd be able to, list 10, but yeah, I did. I think I actually had 11, but I removed 2 of those because those movies didn't really make me angry. Oh, that's it. Sure, you wouldn't like me when I'm angry. Those other 2 movies, they were just basically movies that I was like, they're okay. They're not that great, but they're okay. So those sorts of movies don't really end up on worst list for me. Worst lists are ones that just generate this very negative emotion in me. And so that's why I picked the ones I did, got rid of the other two. I can't even remember now which ones they were, but they weren't ones that I felt qualified as worst in my mind. So anyway, that's it for this list. The next one that I'll be hopefully filming tomorrow will be my most anticipated movies of 2022. I found some pretty interesting ones that I didn't even know about, but I'm like, okay, I anticipate them now because they look really interesting. So I got to go digging for information on those so I can talk about them at some length in the video tomorrow. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up for now. I've got a lot of editing to do before I can get this up, and we'll see you guys later. Adios.